Welcome to Nightmares Incorporated, where our goal is to make your sleep anything but restful. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's tale, entitled Last Call. Keaton Price had owned the Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern for the last 15 years. While it certainly wasn't the preeminent hotspot to be, business was always good. For a few years, it had become kind of a college bar, as if the young men and women returning home to Coleman after their first year at the university had found it a quaint, trendy place to drink and play out their various dramas. While Price hadn't minded having a younger crowd around, they were certainly good for business, he also hadn't minded when they moved on to another small tavern as their home base. The older he got, the less he understood the younger generation. He didn't understand the noise that they claimed was music, the insignificant problems that they treated as world-ending crises, the need to be loud just for the sake of being seen, or the pointless brawls that would break out occasionally by two young men desperate to prove their manhood. While he was aware that his own elders had probably felt the same about him when he was younger, that didn't change the fact that he mostly found the younger generation annoying. He supposed part of it had been plain jealousy. While he was only 45, he couldn't help but look at the 20-somethings that were frequenting his bar during that time and feel a slight pang as he remembered his own youth. That the hope and idea of endless possibilities that had laid before him at that time slowly eroded away, as life, family, and responsibilities forced him into a role that hadn't exactly been what he had had in mind for himself. Keaton didn't mind owning a bar, enjoyed it in fact, but it hadn't been what he had aspired to do. So he supposed that looking at these young people who so far had not realized that the world at large did not give two shits and a popsicle about their life plans, and who had not seen their dreams be crushed under the relentless weight of duty and responsibility, he envied them. And in that envy, he judged them too harshly. Except for their music. He thought that was still dog shit. But soon the college crowd had faded out, and his regular clientele had phased back in. People who punched the clock for their 40 hours a week and insurance coverage. People who had mortgages. People who had the naivety of youth slapped out of them by the reality of a world that didn't find them as special as their parents did. People who were closer to his own age. Folks that would spin Garth Brooks on the juke as readily as they would play Nirvana or Tupac. His people, in other words. People who were looking to unwind after a hard week or meet with coworkers for a friendly beer after work. These were the people that Keaton had built this bar for. The Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern was an unassuming establishment nestled in the heart of Coleman, Virginia. As folks stepped inside, the tavern would reveal a cozy, rustic charm that immediately felt like home. The wooden floors, worn but well-maintained, creak slightly underfoot, telling tales of countless patrons who have walked these grounds. The walls are adorned with eclectic memorabilia, vintage beer signs, old photographs of Coleman, the framed jersey from local sports teams. A long, polished bar stretches across one side of the room, lined with well-worn stools that invite you to sit and stay a while. Behind the bar, shelves stocked with an array of liquor bottles provide a colorful backdrop. On any given Saturday night, the Hole-in-the-Wall would come alive with a mix of locals who had made this their go-to spot. As the evening progresses, the bar fills up with a diverse blend of patrons. Construction workers swap stories of their week over pints of beer. Off-duty police officers unwind and share a laugh. University professors debate the latest theories with a glass of whiskey in hand. Blue-collar workers and a few white-collar professionals mingle, everyone finding common ground in the relaxed, hospitable atmosphere. The jukebox would usually start thumping around 7 p.m. and wouldn't get to take a break until he closed down at 2. The tunes creating a background hum that would complement the lively conversations and occasional bursts of laughter. As the night wears on, the tavern becomes a tapestry of human interactions. Friends gather around tables, sharing platters of wings and nachos, while reminiscing about old times. Price, who was always a fixture of the establishment, would move expertly behind the bar, pouring drinks with a practiced ease and exchanging friendly banter with the regulars. He always had 2 other bartenders that would work the bar with him on weekends, and that took up most of the other shifts during the week. The atmosphere is always warm and inviting, despite the inevitable noise and bustle of a busy evening. The dim lighting would cast a gentle glow, creating cozy pockets where patrons could sit back and enjoy their evening. The scent of fried food would waft through the air, mingling with the tang of spilled beer and the faint hint of tobacco from the smokers outside. Occasionally the door would swing open to admit newcomers, some greeted with enthusiastic cheers from friends waiting inside. The crowd is always welcoming, embracing both regulars and first-timers with a camaraderie that defines the spirit of the hole-in-the-wall tavern. As midnight approaches, the tavern always remains lively, though the pace begins to slow. The conversations become more subdued, the laughter softer, and the jukebox selections mellower. By closing time, the patrons would file out one by one, leaving the tavern quiet once more, ready to welcome a new set of stories and memories the next day. Price had built the Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern to be more than just a bar. He had built it to be a living, breathing part of the Coleman community, where people could come together and unwind, connect, and find solace in good company and good times. And it would appear that this Saturday night was shaping up to be more of the same. As Keaton Price surveyed the lively scene unfolding before him, he couldn't help but smile. It had been a good night so far at the tavern, and the familiar hum of laughter, chatter, and clinking glasses filled the air. Keaton often mused that being a good bartender was a lot like being a good therapist. People tended to share their problems with him, seeking solace in the warm, inviting atmosphere of the tavern. It had unnerved him at first, the things people were willing to share with someone who was essentially a stranger, but over time he came to realize that many of these people that confided in him did so because they didn't have anyone else, or anyone who was willing to listen. That what they wanted more than the booze and the atmosphere was a friendly ear willing to allow them to unburden their minds. Once he realized that, Keaton became more willing to play confidant, and that willingness resulted in repeat business. People who had once been strangers having become regulars, almost friends, inasmuch as someone in the service industry could consider a customer a friend. Over the years, he had heard countless stories, some heartbreaking, some hilarious, and some downright unbelievable. He recalled the young woman who once confided in him about her tumultuous breakup, tears streaming down her face as she sipped her whiskey, retelling what seemed to be the entire history of a relationship that sounded to Keaton like it was doomed from the beginning. A torrid tale of codependence and uncertainty. A toxic cocktail of 2 young people who didn't feel whole when they were by themselves. People who not only needed the validation of another, but also didn't know how to behave when things were good, so they would spin drama and conflict seemingly out of the air. This young woman had had too much to drink that night, and proceeded to try and seek physical comfort with Price. He, of course, had called her an Uber and wished her a good night. He had been divorced twice and currently was practicing a kind of self-imposed celibacy. Yet, even if he hadn't been, he still would have sent her on her way. Keaton always practiced a strict rule of not dating the clientele. He had learned that lesson the hard way through his first marriage. Then there was the rowdy group of construction workers who entertained the bar with their wild tales of misadventure on the job site, half of which were almost certainly bullshit, but they were still entertaining all the same. As Keaton poured drinks and exchanged friendly banter with the regulars, his gaze shifted to a familiar figure seated alone at a table at the far end of the bar. The old man was sitting there, as he was 4 or 5 times a week, having become as much a fixture of the hole in the wall as Price himself was over the last 9 months, tipping his hat slightly in acknowledgement as he received his usual glass of bourbon from one of the waitresses. This old man was a bit of a mystery to Keaton. He would sit quietly, sipping drinks that were brought to him until closing time. He never caused any trouble, never seemed to be stumbling out the door regardless of how much he drank, always tipped generously, but never spoke to anyone. Despite his silence, there always seemed to be something disconcerting about the old guy. Something Keaton couldn't quite put his finger on. He often wondered about the old man's story. Who was he? What had brought him to the hole-in-the-wall tavern so frequently, yet kept him so solitary? Yet regardless of how much it itched at his mind, Keaton respected the man's privacy. He understood that sometimes people just needed a place where they could be alone with their thoughts. He figured that if the old fellow wanted to talk to him, then eventually he would. The rest of the night passed as they most often did, with the mood of the tavern mellowing out as people began taking themselves or their friends home, the Uber drivers showing up to pick up those who were in no condition to drive and didn't have a designated driver available. As the night slowly drew to a close, Keaton noticed that the old man was still sitting at his table, and seeing that last call was about to be announced, he decided that he would bring him his final bourbon of the evening rather than the waitress. He walked over with the drink, and the old man raised his head as he approached. "It's almost last call," Keaton said as he set the drink down on the table. "I thought you might like one more." "Thank you," the old man replied. "But does it have to be?" "Afraid so, my friend," Keaton lamented. "The law's the law." The old man seemed prepared to accept this without argument, but Keaton noticed that there was a familiar look in the old fellow's eyes. It was a haunted, strained kind of look. It was the look of someone who has something eating at their mind. Keaton had seen it many times over the years. It was the look of someone who needed to get something off of their chest. Seizing upon this opportunity to satisfy his own curiosity, Keaton spoke again. "Although, if you don't mind staying till after closing, I usually have a drink to unwind after work. You could join me if you like." "Why do that?" the old man asked. "Well, what's the point in owning a bar if you can't break the rules every once in a while? And," Keaton continued, "if you don't mind me saying, you look like you got a lot on your mind and could use a bit of conversation." "You're not wrong," the old man conceded. "Thank you for the drink and for the offer. I'll accept both." 15 minutes after the tavern had closed for the night, and the rest of the patrons had filed out, with only a few of them throwing a curious look at the old man sitting alone at his table, Keaton sat down with him with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. You know, it's kind of embarrassing that you've been coming in here 4 or 5 times a week for the last 9 months or so, and I don't even know your name, Keaton said as he poured his guest a glass.
Mark Davidson,
the old man answered. Good to formally meet you, Mark, Keaton replied with a smile as he poured his own drink. I'm Keaton Price. With that little bit of ice having been broken off, Keaton ventured further to try and spark a conversation. So are you retired, Mark? He asked.
Something like that,
the man responded. What did you do before?
I was a theoretical physicist. I taught at a few universities, wrote a few papers, and a couple of books discussing string theory. While it wasn't the most lucrative of careers, it was a passion of mine. And in the end, the work I did involving it was just a means of paying the bills. For me, it was a more personal venture. I was looking for something, you could say.
Yeah? Keaton asked, seizing upon a topic he could pursue. What were you looking for? Davidson took a sip of his bourbon and sighed, sounding like a man who has traveled far with a heavy burden and knows he has much farther to go.
To understand that, I'd have to give you a brief rundown of some of the history of my family. That way, my motivations make sense to you. And hopefully, knowing those motivations, I'll sound less crazy once I come to my part in the tale.
Start wherever you want, Keaton invited.
Thank you, sir. That's very kind. In truth, I've been wanting to tell this story for quite some time. It may take a little while,
Davidson warned. We got time, Keaton said. Davidson took another sip from his drink, and the corner of his mouth twitched into the semblance of a smile. And then he began.
My family has always been involved in the hard sciences. Geology, mathematics, physics, biology, etc. Many papers and textbooks have been produced by the Davidson family over the years. One of the exceptions was a man named Archibald, who would be my grandfather a few generations removed. Archibald was fascinated by history and ancient cultures. He also fancied himself an explorer, and in the early 1900s he kept several journals chronicling what could only be described as snipe hunts as he ran down every lead he was given. As you can imagine, this alone made him kind of the black sheep of the family, and where he preferred to fish for leads didn't help that opinion. Archibald frequented taverns to speak with sailors for most of his investigatory work. He would ply them with drink and make notes of the tales they told of their adventures on the high seas. Of course, now we know that most captains' logs written in those days were mostly fictional. But that wasn't common knowledge in Archibald's day, and he believed most of it. He was aware enough to realize that many of the stories must be embellished, but he believed something that I concur with to this day. In most folklore, there is often a speck of truth. And using a form of the scientific method, Archibald spent years comparing one particular set of stories, eliminating everything that conflicted until he was left with the only thing they shared. This process led Archibald to believe that there was an undiscovered landmass to the west of the southern tip of South America, lying at approximately 47 degrees south, 126 degrees west. Of course, now we know that there is nothing there, and that location is dangerously close to Point Nemo. But back in Archibald's time, he had heard enough stories to be convinced that there was not only a landmass in that location, but also artificial structures upon it. So convinced was he that he commissioned a ship captained by a man he had formed a kind of rapport with by the name of Leonard Raleigh, and a crew composed mostly of men of ill repute. The commission was thus: to undertake the 7-month journey out to Archibald's proposed location and see him back safely with evidence that the landmass was there. If there were ancient structures on said landmass, as Archibald believed, then the crew would be more than welcome to take whatever they could carry as a bonus on top of what he had already paid them. The generous payment up front, along with the prospect of plunder, was enough to convince the crew to accept what would be a long voyage through volatile waters. Archibald kept a journal of their voyage, of course, and for the most part, the trip appears to have been uneventful for much of the first 5 months or so. A man died of sickness around 5 months in, which put the crew on edge given the superstitious nature of sailors at the time. But Raleigh kept the men focused on the task at hand and quelled any misgivings they had started to have by reinforcing the promise of treasure at the end of their voyage. It's when they reach their destination and the voyage back to America that the journal becomes garbled and difficult to grasp what Archibald is trying to describe. He describes seeing the landmass nearly 8 months into their journey, but that most of it was underwater. That what they saw was what he described as a tower, or part of a larger structure. The dimensions he gives are impossible by the standards of man-made buildings in the early 1900s, as the structure would compare with buildings of today as far as sheer size goes. He wrote that they anchored off of a section of the island that they believed they could land a rowboat on, and ventured out, and that things went wrong almost immediately. Upon landing on what Archibald described as a part of the structure, as anything that could be considered land of this island was underwater, he described seeing a stone carving of something that he couldn't make sense out of. He writes that it was obviously a picture of something, but that the image kept shifting, as if his mind couldn't grasp what the image actually was. That he could make out humanoid features, but also something that resembled a cephalopod. That he thought he could make out wings, but then thought that perhaps they were extra arms. He writes that the image disturbed him and the crew to no end, and that some of the men claimed that the thing depicted in the stone was staring at them. A few of the men claimed it was speaking to them. Archibald wrote that the crew didn't make it very far inland, but far enough for him to notice that the architecture of the structure did not make any rational sense. He describes that the corners looked wrong, that something that appeared to be a door was too big, that the walkways at times curved straight up, seemingly impossible for anything to traverse, and that the section that they were on appeared to be shifting. Things fell apart when one of the crewmen walked up a slight staircase and seemed to fall sideways through the air, until he impacted what looked like a wall some 50 feet away. Yet Archibald writes that from this wall there was another set of stairs sticking out of it. Another of the crew threw a rock towards the stairs that the man had fallen from, and they all watched as it veered off course and followed the same path as their now deceased crewmate, as if gravity suddenly shifted at that point. The crew became increasingly frazzled, many speaking of curses, all of them now untrusting of where they could step. The journal devolves into chaos at this point. Archibald claims that some members of the crew began speaking in a language that he had never heard before, and that shortly after that, violence broke out. He claims that the crewmates who were speaking what he referred to as gibberish began to attack those who were not. That Captain Raleigh shot 2 of his own men as he escorted Archibald back to the rowboat and back onto the ship. That only 3 other crewmates made it back with them, and that the voyage home was plagued with nightmares and melancholy. Archibald writes that the crew, along with himself, were convinced that something lived within that structure and had been speaking to them. beckoning them to venture into the temple's depths. Of the survivors, Archibald claims that Raleigh suffered a mental breakdown and lived out the rest of his days in an asylum, and that the other 3 men drank themselves to death soon after returning home. Archibald himself fared no better, as he became obsessed with the idea of returning to that temple that he had fled from. He writes that he would try and explain to people what they had found, but was dismissed. He writes theories about what he believed had made that temple, and records a few of his nightmares about the thing that was depicted in the stone carving, one day breaking free from whatever restrains it and rising from the ocean, inflicting madness upon all who lay eyes upon its shifting form. The journals read like the ravings of a madman from that point on, and the last information on Archibald is a news article reporting his disappearance, how he had left behind a wife and 4 children, and how the affluent Davidson family had posted a reward for his return. That all anyone knew was that he had been speaking of commissioning another voyage out to the island he had claimed to have found. Conventional thinking leads to the conclusion that he likely died at sea, along with the poor souls he had convinced to go with him. The reason I'm telling you this is that Archibald's story was instrumental in shaping my life. How so? Keaton asked. The staff had all left by the time Davidson had finished the retelling of his unfortunate ancestor's tale, and half of the bottle of bourbon he had brought to the table was gone. From outside, the wind began to pick up, blowing autumn leaves against the windows that showed a now empty street in front of the tavern. My grandfather would talk to me about Archibald quite a bit when I was younger. While my father thought the story was complete nonsense, a black mark on the family legacy, my grandfather thought differently. He would recount Archibald's tale many times during my childhood, painting vivid pictures of the strange events and peculiar architecture described in the journals. Though my grandfather always expressed a healthy skepticism about the story's veracity, he was nevertheless fascinated by the details of the temple's construction. The odd, non-Euclidean architecture baffled him, for even if the temple had been erected by an advanced ancient civilization, or extraterrestrial beings, he reasoned that it would still be designed for 3-dimensional creatures. And while he makes note that Archibald was indeed intelligent, he was never known as a man of much imagination. This enigma sparked my curiosity and led me to ponder the possible existence of higher-dimensional beings. I often found myself contemplating what a structure built by such entities in higher dimensions would look like in our 3-dimensional reality. It was this thought that shaped my academic pursuits and fueled my passion for uncovering the mysteries of the universe, something that I think many people don't ponder enough. We tend to operate under the assumption that the reality in which we exist is far more mundane than it actually is. During evenings by the fireplace, my grandfather would elaborate on the peculiarities of the temple as described by Archibald. He mentioned the columns that seemed to twist and writhe, the hallways that appeared longer on the inside than the outside, and the walls etched with symbols that defied any known language. The bizarre geometries and the inexplicable allure of the place haunted my dreams and stirred a hunger in me for understanding. Eventually, I pursued a degree in physics, driven by the desire to understand how the world operated, and if it was, in fact, bigger than we thought. I became wildly interested in ancient legends, folk tales describing gods or godlike beings that have been forgotten by the passage of time. I traveled to remote corners of the globe, observing the excavations of forgotten ruins and the decoding of ancient scripts, always hoping to find a clue that would lead me to something similar to the elusive temple Archibald described. But what I found were so many stories that were similar, yet not exactly right. However, all of these stories shared the commonality of something that seemed to not obey the laws of our universe, interacting with human beings. My research led me to consult experts in various fields, from cryptographers to historians to theologians, all in an effort to make sense of what Archibald claimed to have seen. Their insights, though intriguing, often raised more questions than answers. Yet with each new piece of information, I felt as though I was getting closer to uncovering a kind of hidden but fundamental truth. The same truth that had perhaps driven Archibald mad, and in turn had reduced my grandfather to little more than a raving lunatic as the years wore on. He would find himself constantly puzzling over one question. What sort of being descends by going sideways? It wasn't until I had children of my own that I began to form something of a theory. I was reading a comic book with my youngest son, Jamie, a book called The Unbreakable Rabbit, an inoffensive but silly little series about a rabbit who's gained superpowers and used them to fight against other anthropomorphic animals. Jamie was only 4, so he couldn't read yet, so I was reading the book to him. Naturally, his eyes scanned all of the pictures as I was reading. A slight smile appeared on Davidson's face as he recalled this memory, and a single tear tracked down his right cheek, as memories such as this are sometimes tainted with bitterness. Keaton remained quiet, allowing the old man to continue when he was ready. I had begun a fresh page when Jamie said, "Oh no, Daddy, Professor Coyote is setting a trap." I admonished him not to scan ahead, but he paid me no attention, instead yelling out, "Look out, Unbreakable Rabbit!" I finished the comic that night without thinking about what had happened until later. As I was in my study, I began wondering to myself, what if the rabbit had been able to hear Jamie? What if somehow Jamie had been able to warn this character about what was going to happen before it did? And that Jamie wouldn't be able to accomplish this because he was some great, all-powerful being, but simply because he had a broader view of the world in which the rabbit existed. Now, I had been studying string theory already by this point, but hadn't really paid it much mind because it did not fit the model that I had envisioned when I was younger. There are higher dimensions mentioned in string theory, yes, but they exist mostly to balance out the mathematical equations. String theory does not work if reality is limited only to the 4 dimensions that we're aware of. So in these models, the higher dimensions are described as being folded up incredibly small, existing only as a tool, really. However, sitting in my study, thinking about my son trying to communicate with a fictional rabbit, I pondered the idea of higher dimensions that exist right alongside us, only we can't perceive them. The same way that Unbreakable Rabbit exists alongside us, but if the characters on the page were real, they would be wholly unaware of our existence, and that we could shape their world in any way that we saw fit. I wondered what it would mean if it were the same for us. If beings from a higher reality were aware of us and able to interact with any point in our history. If they could see our past, our future, laid out in front of them like a comic strip, wouldn't beings like that be gods to us? Maybe even the uppercase G kind? As in, our creators? Or maybe only something that stumbled across us and claimed to be so. "Wait," Keaton interjected. "Are you trying to describe God?" "Why not?" Davidson proposed,
the wind from outside now howling against the walls of the tavern. Think about it, the old man continued. If you build a house, you don't build it while you're standing in the living room. If a god truly did create our universe, wouldn't it stand to reason that they exist outside of that universe? And if so, then where could they reside? And what if these hypothetical beings placed something that they had built within our plane of existence? Something that followed the rules of their dimension and not ours? Would we even be able to understand what we were seeing? Would we even see it as it actually was? Or would we only see what our minds could interpret, seeing only a vague representation of what it really looked like? The problem with my theory, of course, was that I had no way of testing it. After all, how could I test the existence of higher dimensions that by my own admission would be impossible for me to perceive? Years went by with me puzzling over this problem, until a colleague whom I had shared my hypothesis with suggested revisiting the concept of quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is an attempt to reconcile the principles of quantum mechanics with general relativity. We know that general relativity describes the macroscopic world, planets, stars, galaxies, with incredible accuracy, whereas quantum mechanics governs the microscopic world, the realm of atoms and subatomic particles, where things behave very differently. The challenge lies in unifying these two seemingly incompatible theories. General relativity depicts gravity as the curvature of space-time caused by mass, while quantum mechanics treats forces as interactions mediated by particles. At first glance, these theories appear irreconcilable, but some physicists believe that a deeper underlying framework must exist, one that encompasses both. One approach to quantum gravity is through the concept of quantized spacetime. Try to imagine spacetime not as a smooth continuum, but as composed of discrete quanta, tiny, indivisible units, much like the atoms that make up matter. These granular structures could potentially resolve the contradiction between the two theories. There is also the idea of loop quantum gravity, which suggests that space-time itself is woven from loops, forming a complex network. This theory posits that space is not infinitely divisible, and there is a smallest possible unit of space. Quantum gravity was, of course, completely speculative, as we lacked the technology and experimental means to probe these minuscule, or if I was correct, nearly infinite scales. It was while contemplating these ideas that I realized they might offer a way to test my hypothesis about higher dimensions. If we could find evidence of quantum gravitational effects, it might open a window into these hidden realms, proving that our universe is but one layer of a much grander, multidimensional structure. Davidson paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The wind outside seemed to howl in agreement, as if nature itself acknowledged the profound mysteries he was trying to lay bare. I decided that the only way I could perhaps test my theory was with a quantum computer. While it wasn't a certainty, it was indeed possible that a computer such as that, once taught how to measure gravity in our own dimension, should be able to detect it in planes both higher and lower. And that is what brought me to my final assignment as a professor at Miskatonic University, simply because I believed that they would fund my project. While they were far from the prestigious center of learning that they had been in the early 1900s, they were still a very wealthy institution, with a history of not shying away from the fringe edges of academic research. And given their decline over the previous 30 years, I correctly estimated that they would be more than willing to take part in my experiment.
If it worked, they had nothing to lose, because even if I did not discover what I was looking for, they would have created the world's first quantum computer.
Hold on, Keaton interjected again. The first quantum computer just went online a few months ago.
Of course it did, Davidson replied with a smirk.
When was this?
Keaton inquired. Well, Davidson said in the tone of a man reflecting upon a time long ago. I arrived at Miskatonic University in the year 2000 after securing their pledge to fund my research, and the computer was constructed by 2010. The university spared no expense bringing in the finest technical minds of that time, and after securing a binding NDA, the work took surprisingly little time.
Hold on, man, Keaton interrupted. I'm not meaning to doubt your story, sir, but if the first quantum computer came online 15 years ago, then how come I never heard of it?
That's simple, my friend, Davidson replied with a sigh. You only hear about an experimental technology when everything goes right.
And something went wrong,
Keaton surmised. As soon as we turned the goddamn thing on, Davidson said bitterly.
Lightning briefly illuminated the outside world, joining the wind in the increasingly unfriendly weather. The inside of the tavern seemed to grow a bit dimmer, despite the lights not changing at all. From behind Davidson, Keaton thought he could see a slight shimmer like a heat haze at the other end of the bar. He wiped a hand across his eyes, and it was gone. The light seemed to have returned to normal as well. He dismissed it. So what happened? He asked the old man as he poured him another drink. Davidson took a deep breath and stared into his drink before continuing. He lifted it, took a long pull, and then continued with his story.
The moment we switched on the computer, a hole in reality opened up. It was like nothing I could have ever imagined, and wholly unexpected given the parameters of the experiment. The computer should only have been capable of measuring gravity, producing a mathematical readout. Whatever happened, we didn't cause it. O'Connell had been the only other person in the room with me at the time of testing, and we found ourselves in an unfamiliar reality, where nothing made conventional sense. The laws of physics, as we knew them, no longer applied. The sky wasn't the sky. There were clouds, or filaments, that were an eerie shade of violet, and the ground beneath us seemed to ripple like water. And the world around us seemed to be infinite and infinitesimal at the same time. Keaton leaned in, captivated by the tale, his drink momentarily forgotten.
You mean everything changed?
Davidson nodded gravely. I wouldn't say that the world changed, he said hesitantly, as if this were a part of the story that he was unsure of. I think we were seeing something that was already there, only beyond our normal perceptions. The world around us shifted and became warped, defying logic and reason. O'Connell began ranting, staring up at something above us that I couldn't see. He screamed and pleaded with it, his eyes wild with terror. His voice echoed unnaturally, as if the air itself was distorted.
What was it?
Keaton whispered, his voice barely audible over the brewing storm outside. I'll come to that, Davidson said. Initially, I was distracted by something else, a tapestry, or at least something that resembled one. It was about the size of a billboard, a rectangular shape that was maybe 15 feet by 30, and suspended in the air before me. And upon it, I came to realize was the entire history of the known universe. Every event, every moment, captured in intricate detail. Stars exploded into brilliant bursts, planets formed and crumbled, and civilizations rose and fell in a dance of cosmic creation and destruction. Keaton's eyes widened.
You saw the history of the universe?
Yes, Davidson said, his voice trembling with the weight of the memory. It was beautiful and horrifying all at once. The tapestry showed everything, from the birth of stars to the rise and fall of civilizations. It was as if the universe itself had laid bare its secrets before us. The patterns were so complex, yet so orderly, like a grand design that was beyond our comprehension. And it was at that moment that I realized that I wasn't seeing the history of our universe, but the universe itself. All of it was playing out in real time. And while it should have been a jumble of nonsensical images to me, I understood all of it. I understood it because in that moment, I was above it, outside of it. I could comprehend the past, the present, all possible futures, all at once. It was our entire universe, and it took up only a small fraction of the world I found myself in.
And O'Connell?
Keaton asked, his curiosity piqued. Davidson's face darkened. When I turned to frantically tell him what I was looking at, he was gone. I moved past the tapestry, which at that point I realized was the universe that I had inadvertently stepped out of, to see if perhaps he was obscured by it. And that's when I saw it.
What did you see?
Keaton encouraged. I saw a void that appeared to stretch out into eternity. A starless, dark abyss, and within it, an entity. I don't remember what it looked like because it didn't have a true form. It shifted endlessly, changed shape, size, appeared as a star and then a black hole. But I didn't need to see it to know what it was. For lack of a better word, it was God. Or at least something that could only be described as such. But it wasn't a loving, intelligent creator. Instead, I knew that this was nothing but endless chaos. A blind, idiot God that was wholly unaware of its own existence, or even that of the universe that had sprung from it. I knew that this was the primordial chaos, that the reason my prayers as a child went unanswered was not because my God didn't care about me, but because it wasn't even aware that it had created me. We were nothing but a dream that this thing was having, or simply a product of its own pointless existence. I don't know how I knew these things, but I knew that they were true. I screamed and backed away, turning to try and find O'Connell, but also to try and escape the knowledge that I now possessed. And that was when I noticed the being that was not only above me, but beneath and around, that I was standing within it. I looked up, and my scream cut off due to utter shock. I saw O'Connell floating above me, his body twisting and warping, seeming to come apart as if the man had been turned to string. His face was contorted in an expression of sheer agony, eyes wide with a terror that surpassed even my own. It was as if the very fabric of his being was unraveling, being drawn up into the mass that surrounded us. I tried to reach out, to grasp him, but my arm felt heavy and insubstantial. as though I was a mere shadow in this nightmare. The being that was around us seemed to pulse and breathe, a living entity of swirling clouds and filaments, an entity that seemed composed of yellow and orange orbs that constantly moved and shifted, coalescing at times only to break apart again. Whatever this being was, it was swallowing O'Connell piece by piece. As it absorbed and erased his very being, this entity began whispering secrets and truths that no human mind could comprehend. The air was thick with an indescribable force, pushing and pulling at my senses, and I felt myself teetering on the brink of madness. The primal chaos enveloped us, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to crush my very soul, leaving me gasping for breath. Among all of its incoherent recitations of esoteric secrets long hidden, I could make out something that sounded like an invitation. That I could remain here, just as O'Connell apparently had wished to do. That all knowledge would be mine, all secrets known to me. That before me was the key and the gate, the essence of knowledge itself. I did not speak to this being, for our language has no meaning within its realm. Instead, I refused with every fiber of my own being, my very essence, my soul, if indeed I have one. Almost instantaneously, I was back within the lab, standing dumbly before the computer, which was shooting sparks, black smoke billowing out from its insides, only to then fold in upon itself, smaller and smaller until nothing remained. O'Connell was not with me, which was proof to me that I had not hallucinated. He had stayed. He had become one with the entity. I went into a rage, not only due to the loss of my colleague and friend, but due to a crushing despair of what I had refused. The only way I can describe it is imagine that you spent your entire life within a monochrome room. A room that lacks a door or a window. Now imagine that one day a door suddenly appears, and you see the outside world for the first time. You see trees, grass, the sky, the sun. And while you don't have words for what you're seeing, you understand what they are, what they mean, and where your place in the universe actually is. And then the door slams shut, never to open again, leaving you to realize that there is an entire universe beyond your monochrome room that you will never glimpse again, and never hope to understand even if you lived 1,000 years. That's how I felt. We're not real. Not really. We are less than shadows produced by a slumbering thing that has no more wisdom or enlightenment than a Boltzmann brain. That our universe was created by a being that isn't even aware of itself, but that alongside this being, there's something sentient. Something that exists outside of our universe, but within it at the same time. A lock and a key. And that this thing had revealed to me that all it would take for our entire universe to vanish would be for the primordial chaos to wake up from its unfathomable dreams. I may have hurt a few people during my rampage. I honestly don't rightly remember. I know that I was subdued, detained, and remanded to the Arkham Mental Health Care Facility for the next 5 years. Needless to say, my family fell apart. Although my sons were grown, they were academics more in line with my father than I, and I became an embarrassment to them with my constant ranting about what I had seen. Keaton shivered, not just from the cold draft that had crept into the tavern, but from the chilling tale Davidson had recounted. What happened then? Davidson shrugged, a haunted look in his eyes. I was released in 2015 and tried to return to a life of normal scientific pursuits. I buried myself in my work, wrote papers based only on solid physics, tried to find my way back into the world of academia. I tried to forget what I had seen. But some things, Mr. Price, some things you just can't unsee. Sometimes at night, I still get glimpses of that tapestry, and I hear O'Connell's voice echoing in my head. The storm raged on outside, but inside the tavern an eerie silence hung in the air, as if the very walls were absorbing the weight of Davidson's words. Keaton took a long sip of his drink, trying to process the unimaginable. I then tried to find my way back to the world that is all around us, but imperceptible. I knew that I would never receive funding again, as even Miskatonic had covered up the massive failure of the computer, and in the year 2012 something else had happened that had crippled the university, possibly permanently. While I could only get the scant information from the newspapers, I know that it involved the disappearance of 7 students and another professor of theoretical physics. As far as I know, they tried to repeat my experiment, only with catastrophically worse results. So, seeing as the world of academia was closed off to me, I began seeking other ways to return to that endless realm. I'm not ashamed to admit that I became obsessed, consumed by the need to find a way back. I delved into ancient texts, sought out forgotten lore, and tried to decipher cryptic manuscripts. The rituals I found were complex, often requiring rare and obscure items. I traveled far and wide, searching for artifacts and ingredients that promised to bridge the gap between our world and the one that I had glimpsed. All of this based solely on hearsay and old legends. There were nights when I would perform some of these rituals in remote locations, away from prying eyes. I tried to summon entities, invoke spirits, or open portals. Each attempt left me exhausted and more desperate. I encountered some strange phenomena, lights flickering, shadows moving, whispers in the dark, but none provided the passage that I sought. One method involved the use of a supposed ancient mirror, said to reflect not just our world, but the hidden dimensions beyond. I spent months tracking it down, finally acquiring it from a dubious collector. I enacted a ceremony, chanting incantations before the mirror, but instead of revealing the hidden realms, it showed only my own haunted reflection. Then there were the symbols and sigils, intricate designs that supposedly aligned with the frequencies of the unseen worlds. I drew them meticulously, surrounding myself with candles and artifacts, trying to attune myself to the other dimension. I experienced sensations, tingling, chills, the feeling of being watched, but any gateway remained elusive. I even sought out others who claimed to have knowledge of the occult and forbidden sciences. We formed a clandestine group for a while, sharing knowledge and resources, conducting experiments together. But each attempt ended in failure, sometimes dangerously so, leaving us all more paranoid and fragmented. Through all of this, Mr. Pierce, I discovered that some doors are meant to remain closed, and some realms are not for us to explore. My search for O'Connell and that other dimension became an obsession that consumed years of my life, and the cost was beyond measure. Davidson's voice trailed off, the weight of his futile efforts pressing down on him. Keaton felt the depth of Davidson's despair, the relentless pursuit of the unfathomable.
The storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil within the tavern, as both men sat in silence, in midst of an unending quest for answers.
And that was when they came,
Davidson said quietly.
Who?
Keaton asked.
The thing you keep glancing over my shoulder at.
Keaton started a bit. He meant to say that there had been nothing there but a trick of the light, but he looked again and saw that the slight haze had returned.
It looks like a shimmer, correct?
Davidson inquired.
Or a heat haze, a distortion of the air, standing at the other end of the room, right?
How did you... Keaton began, but Davidson cut in.
And to our left, near the bathroom doors. Do you see that one as well?
Keaton turned his head and gasped when he saw what Davidson had described. His heart hammered within his chest, as he could clearly see that from this distance it looked more like a distortion in a mirror, rather than a shimmer or a haze. He began to rise from his seat when Davidson quietly told him to sit back down. He looked back at the old man. What the fuck is that?
I don't know what they are, or even what they look like. Like you, I only see the imprint they make upon our dimension. I only see how their very presence distorts space-time around them. But I do have a strong feeling that it would be in your best interest to not react to them any further. I don't believe they've noticed you yet. The only thing I do know for certain about them is that they follow me wherever I go. And whenever I try to engage in any form of experiment or ritual designed to return me to that realm where O'Connell stayed, they draw closer to me. I think something has noticed my meddling in things that I should leave alone, and sent a couple of watchdogs to keep an eye on me. And while I cannot prove it, I have no doubt that if I were to continue in my search, whatever these things are would tear me apart, perhaps even shredding me down to my last atom, erasing me from existence. The same way we likely would burn a comic book if one of the characters began speaking to us as if it were aware of our world. And that's why I've been trying to work up the courage to head north again. Back to Arkham, Davidson said as he finished the last of his drink.
Why? Keaton asked, using all of his willpower to not look at the distortion in the air again.
Because while Miskatonic may have covered up the details of my experiment, I have to make sure that none of my work remains. I have to be sure that no one else can tread on the path that I walked. I've come to realize that these things exist all around us, all the time, and that it would be wise to not draw more of their attention to us. If any of my work remains, it has to be destroyed.
With that, Davidson rose to his feet and stuck out his hand to Keaton. Keaton rose as well and accepted the handshake.
Thank you for the drinks, Mr. Price,
the old man said.
And thank you for lending a friendly ear. I didn't realize how much I needed to tell that story.
Wait, Keaton said, but Davidson cut him off again.
If you ignore them, they should go away on their own. Just don't let them know that you're aware of their presence. I have to go now, Mr. Price.
Mark Davidson disengaged from the handshake, put on the dingy brown coat he always wore, and began walking towards the front door. Wait, Keaton said again. Do you need a ride somewhere, or an Uber? It's raining like a motherfucker out there.
I'll be fine, Mr. Price. But thank you. And remember what I said. Don't let them know that you're aware of them.
Before Keaton could say anything else, Davidson was out the door, the howling of the wind drowning out the world for a moment, before the front door swung closed. Keaton didn't sleep well that night, or for many nights after. And when he saw the news report of the fire that had engulfed Miskatonic University and swept through Arkham, he was not surprised. Nor did he have to ponder over how it had started. But when he noticed the distortion in the air, standing no more than 6 feet away from him, and gleaned an impression of something that could be described as insectoid or reptilian, or neither, Keaton had shut the TV off and returned to work. Keaton Price still owns the Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern, but he's not as talkative as he used to be. He mainly has bartenders run the day-to-day, only checking in once in a while to make sure everything is running smoothly. He drinks a lot more these days. He finds that being inebriated more days than not keeps him from dwelling on things that he'd rather not think about. That the air distorts less when he is on the brink of drunkenness. He finds that dulling his senses not only to the world around him, but also to the far larger realm that exists just beyond his perceptions, makes day-to-day life easier. He sometimes wonders what happened to Mark Davidson, if the old man perished within the fire that he undoubtedly set, or if he survived somehow. Is the man at peace? Or did those things he described as watchdogs finally catch up with him? He sometimes wonders what else may have been contained within Miskatonic University. What else Davidson may have destroyed, or unwittingly released. When he begins to think this way for too long, Keaton pours himself another glass of bourbon, and allows it to dull his mind, to halt his train of thought. He tells himself often that Davidson was just a lonely, mentally unstable old man, that his story was nothing but the raving of a deranged mind. And when he's drunk, Keaton can almost believe this. But in those fleeting moments between, when he first awakes with his head pounding and the air around him distorted and shimmering like pools of water, before he begins his day drinking anew, he knows differently. And before his mind dulls enough for the air around him to return to normal, for him to be firmly grounded within his perception of reality, Keaton repeats what Davidson had claimed to have been told during his time in what could only be described as the real world. I am the key and the gate, the guardian of all knowledge and the giver of all knowledge, Keaton sometimes whispers. But the knowing comes with a price. Maybe just knowing you aren't real is all it takes to unravel your own existence. He then continues drinking until the world itself disappears into a blacked out haze.
Thank you for joining us here at Nightmares Incorporated. And we hope to see you again next time when we bring you another original story. Until then, sweet dreams.